two, one. We won't be soft. The first thing I'd like to point out is the current economic crisis that is happening because the dollar has strengthened is due to a host of other factors that are external to the US economy. Things like COVID and the supply shock it has created, things like the Ukraine war that is intertwined with the way in which demand and supply globally has impacted the economy, has meant that a lot of the things that you see as a symptom now have deeper reasons behind it. So I don't think illustrations of just suffering right now is good enough reason of this motion passing. We also prefer that the dollar is used by all countries around the world. We're happy to defend the norm of things like SWIFT or things like preferring credit cards from Visa instead of Chinese Union Pay. I'll talk about three broad things. First, why dollar is inherently less volatile than any other currency when pegged against. Secondly, why one currency within your foreign currency reserve, i.e. the dollar, is better than fracturing it into a basket of reserves, which opening government would like to defend. Third, why pegging against the dollar is an important foreign policy tool that we ought to give the United States. First, why is dollar inherently more stable? The first thing I'd like to posit is the US democratic system has the biggest checks and balances that make sure that the dollar has a floating value that is stable and predictable. There are three reasons under this. Number one, the US is the biggest economy in the world where it has diversified into primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. So you have things like oil in primary and machines in secondary, or even service sector in the tertiary, all of which means it is by far the most diversified economy where its currency, if you peg against, means you have inherently less risk. Number two, democratic checks and balances. The political institutions, the autonomy of the central bank, all are inherently more prone within the United States. The only thing OG says against this is our regulation has failed for a period of time. But even that, we've seen a lot of that removed because of the failures of 2008 and the recession it has caused. This is because the political system allows for you to recognize why you suffered at that point in time, hold politicians accountable, and have conversations about how you can best mitigate that crisis going forward, which is why a lot of regulation happened post 2008, simply because the institutions of the United States are stronger than anywhere else. Third, assuming all of this is not true, and maybe there is some level of lobbying that happens within the United States, predictability of the United States is far higher. Why is predictability important? This is because currency value is often based on hedging and on speculation. So the fact that you have access to information from a very free-floating economy and indices like S&P 500, or the fact that politicians are actively challenging each other and talking and discussing about where the economy is headed, or there are two really powerful political parties that are always going against each other, means there's always access to information for you to access and understand where this currency is going. Why is this comparatively worse in their world? The first thing I'd like to posit is small countries are unlikely to be rational actors as they themselves would like to posit. This is because countries are nothing but an amalgamation of politicians who want to gain power within these small countries, who also have weaker institutions than the United States. What this means is when you have promises from Russia or China of really good economic inflow in the short term that puts you in power, you as an actor are often likely to trade off long-term economic risk, because at that point in time, when your tenure is over, it's something you don't need to care about. That's why a lot of these small countries around China have systematically sided with them. The difference is because the norm is you have to still use or peg yourself against the US dollar, your foreign currency reserve was not based on yuan or rubles. What this means is pressures from big actors means you might still end up with one other currency as your foreign currency reserve, except it'll be a far riskier economy that you're pegged against. First, because China and Russia are artificially controlled by their government. The currency float is artificially controlled, which means, although best case scenario, you just don't have information. How many of us know what the Chinese government is thinking, or what Putin is thinking, or what his next step will be? That breeds uncertainty and risk that makes your currency far more unstable. Number two, there's less ability for you to hold this government accountable in those cases. Even if the alternative is the European Union, maybe that is an alternative. It's unclear why that is. A federal state where the United States has control over budgets of different states and its problems means you're more able to control risks within that. But EU can't control what the Greek government does, which inherently breeds more risk. The first argument proves inherently it is likely the foreign currency reserve will be on one currency instead of many. And when that happens, the US is inherently a better actor, and therefore the US dollar is something we prefer. Second argument, fracturing. We think that there's a increasing likelihood that you will peg your currency in a way in which is really random, which means, so evidence of the fact that India wants to trade in Indian rupees while Russia wants to trade in Russian rupees. The first reason is the failure of the dollar breeds insecurity. You don't know what the next big economy is. Is it Russia? Is it China? It's hard to often predict where the economy will be 5 years down the line. The second is oftentimes there are ways in which you're caught in the struggle of politics. That means you have to have different actors cater to at the same time. What this means is, on a worst case, you will irrationally pick different currencies and put that as part of your basket. Why is this really bad? The first reason is, when you have reserves in different kinds of currencies, you often make sure trade becomes more difficult with countries that don't have the basket in those same amount of currencies. So say country A pegs its reserves based on rubles, country B pegs its reserve based on yuans. The fracturing or the way you diversify that basket inherently creates more risk when you have to trade with each other, because the conversion steps happen at an extra layer. So you first convert to yuan, then you convert to rubles, then you convert to the country you're trading with. What this ultimately means is you have less free trade between countries. Before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
If the Chinese economy is that unstable, wouldn't countries be more likely to choose the euro than they would the yuan?
First, you need to explain the incentives of EU to diversify to the same extent as China. Second, the politicians within these small countries and the way they interact. That's analysis that you're missing. So the first thing I'd like to posit is free trade becomes far more difficult when there are more layers in the conversion process of currencies. What this means is comparative advantage shrinks. The alternative that we defend is $1 that inherently allows everyone to trade with each other, that minimizes the costs of international trade and allows you to specialize, which improves your ability to export and import and have efficiency among economies. So fracturing in and of itself is a bad thing. Lastly, this is a tool that the US uses as a tool of global politics. So the fact that all countries have dollars pegged to it allows the US to sanction countries like Russia. Why is this important, and why is this an actor that we want internationally? First, US has internal accountability versus any other actor. It has a diversity of minorities that care about global issues because they're from those countries or have families there, or they consist of educated liberals that care about external issues. Chinese populations or Russian populations are unlikely to do so to a greater degree. Further reasons for this in DLO, but it's evidently clear that the dollar is less risky than the alternatives. Very glad to oppose.
The reason open government is out of this debate is because in DPM, they claim stability is not preferable. 3 reasons why this is not true. Number one, if stability is something that we already have under our side, which they have conceded to a certain extent, by the way, means that a stable currency is much easier to hold a standard against. So for example, controlling or floating your currency against one stable currency is far easier. So for example, if you want to devalue your currency in that particular sense, it's easier to control it and hedge it against the US dollar, because then you don't have to care about how the yuan is moving or the euro is moving or the pound is moving and so on and so forth. One standard is much better in terms of stability and so on and so forth. Secondly, markets are far more predictable, right? When you are trading with a particular country, when different companies are trading with each other, when you have a basket of currencies within your reserves and you do not know which sort of a currency that you're going to get from that particular country, it's far harder to predict the value of goods and so on and so forth. This is incredibly important, because if you don't know the value of goods, you wouldn't know how much to order. If you don't know how much to order, your ability to trade with other countries, smaller countries that opening government is so concerned about, goes down at that particular point in time, because of the simple reason that you do not have markets, currency markets that are as predictable anymore. You're more likely to trade with countries with more stable economies rather than countries which has certain advantages such as low labor costs and so on and so forth, which is very important under our side, because that's how they achieve economic growth and so on and so forth. Number three, and this is also to a certain extent integrated within stability and so on and so forth. They said that, oh, but every country now caters to the US. But literally, like, no, like every other country trades with every other country on the basis of reserve currency, because of the fact that every country in the world has a dollar reserve. Even freaking Russia has a dollar reserve, which has been frozen. That's a different story. But even Russia has a dollar reserve means that you can trade with any other country in the world, because you can use the predictability of the US dollar to hedge against. So for example, when Zambia wants to trade with Rwanda, they can use a dollar as a convertibility in between these two currencies. In a world where you hedge against that particular currency basket, that becomes far more difficult to do. Why is the currency basket so bad? Because I think CG will probably have to defend it based on the rules of debating and so on and so forth. I'll give you 4 broad reasons why. and rebuttals integrated. Number one, they said that the dollar is not good because they like regulations and so on and so forth do not exist. Untrue. After 2008, we have the Dodd-Frank Act and so on and so forth. The US has become far more sort of sensible in terms of financial regulations. Secondly, they said that on net, the US economy and the US financial system is deregulated. We tell you it's a good thing that it's on net deregulated. What are the alternatives that you have? You have China that is not deregulated, that is heavily, the financial system is heavily hedged against its housing market, which can bust at any point in time because the housing construction across the world can go down, and that market itself can go down at any point in time because the construction companies of China are not making profits currently. Secondly, it's captured by oligopolies on the alternative. If you have a deregulated market, you have more competition, you have more, and it's easier to enter into the market. Like companies such as Lehman Brothers can just be not bailed out and shoved out of the market because it's possible to do so, because they're not an oligopoly that have captured the entire US market, because it's a deregulated market, which is not possible in other major economies. You can say, but the euro is great and so on and so forth. For number one, the euro is a far smaller economy. Two, euro has very similar structures with US. It's basically a budget US at that point in time. Why do you want to complicate things with the euro and so on and so forth? Number three, it also has countries such as Greece, Portugal, and Italy with far worse balance sheets within their economies and have different regulations all across, not a standardized form of regulations. Standardized form of regulations are important in order to have some predictability within financial markets, because deregulated economies allow you to see information within these markets, see information within stock markets, see information within these companies, and disclose information, assess information, because the economy is literally run on information, and that's a good thing that you have in the US. So as to speak, you don't have to go looking for Greece's balance sheets, because that's a bad thing. Thirdly, we tell you that to a large extent, the reason why the US is so stable to a certain extent, and this is true, is through a self-fulfilling prophecy of the dollar being so big, right? And this is quite important, because what I posit to you here is that hypothetically, if you could make one country the home of the one standard currency, that would possibly be the best thing possible, idealistically. But here, the US is the best actor in this particular instance, rather than hedging it towards multiple actors, because that the US is the only country that has the dollar. It has the ability to go for things like loans and fiscal stimuluses, which does not have too much impact on its economy. The reason it's very important is because the 2008 financial crisis could have been far, far worse if the US generally did not have the ability to bail out so many companies and bail out its own, not bail out companies, but bail out its own economy so easily. And the COVID-19 crisis would have been so much worse. By the way, the COVID-19 crisis literally hit every economy in the world. In a hedged economic sense, you would have been far more fucked unless you did not rely on US. Because the reason Biden was able to give so easily fiscal stimulus checks to people was because of the fact that it had the backing of the US dollar, and he knew that the US dollar denomination is the most powerful in the world and it won't lose its value. Therefore, it was able to take loans from external actors because they know that the US loans are the most stable investment. It's pretty much a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because US dollar is so powerful, it allows itself to get out of recessions, in vast majority of cases not even get into recessions to begin with, and that's quite important in terms of controlling economies. Before I move on, I'll take one from closing government. OG?
Okay, your claim that the US is also on its own sometimes stable is missing the point. Our point is that other currencies also diversify in ways that the US doesn't, and the best way to hedge most structural risk is to hedge across many currencies rather than just one.
Amazing. What is the comparative in this particular instance? The comparative is, in vast majority of the cases, because of the way in which the economies are intertwined. First of all, if the US is in a crisis, almost certainly the euro is in a crisis because of the fact that they are so intertwined as an economy generally. In a lot of cases, I've already told you the structural problem with the Chinese economy. But the problem here is every economy, by the sense of economics, goes through a boom and bust cycle, right? At that particular point in time, would you rather hedge your bets on that one economy that you know can use the dollar to fortify its economy in multiple levels versus 5 or 6 currencies where you have no guarantee that these economies will be able to fortify their own economies through the ability of that singular currency? Because in those particular instances, the ability of having that singular currency is so very important that you lose out at the point in time you create a basket. The point at which Chinese economy goes into recession, there is no escaping from this. But when the US goes into recession, there is an easy way out in that particular sense. Lastly, in terms of why is it more important from the perspective of, say countries like Russia, and why we should essentially ban for countries like Ukraine, because the alternative is far worse in terms of geopolitics and so on and so forth. The Chinese and the Russians do not have as much accountability mechanisms as the US does in terms of geopolitics. If you want your ability to stop countries like Russia from going into war, penalize countries through a global standard that has essentially a global country that has things like democratic mechanisms within it, you want the US to have the dollar power, because otherwise literally most most of the sanctions with Russia does not work, because a lot of countries, including Europe, want to trade with Russia at that point in time. The reason you can put so much pressure on Russia and the reason Ukraine hasn't given up on it, given up yet, is because of the simple fact that you could put so much pressure through the financial system. Without that, you're not able to do so within these countries, and you allow a lot of these problems within the world to persist. In the end, we have a far better economy and a far better world. The US dollar needs to persist. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And to all four speakers in the top half.